Henry, Gordon and James were shut up in the sheds for being naughty. They went on strike because they thought they were the most important engines on the island due to each having a tender, and thought they were being treated with disrespect. But their strike had caused a great deal of disruption to the railway, and so Topham Hatt 1 had Thomas, Edward, and at the time, a new engine called Percy, to help out until the big engines learnt their lesson. They did in fact learn their lesson, however, as they were being let out. James looked at the turntable angrily. "I don't need that stupid thing," he protested. Gordon and Henry understood the importance of the turntable allowing them to operate safely, and not thinking of it simply as a status symbol to go with their tenders anymore. But they knew James still resented them after his last incident. "What's with him?" whispered Percy. "Well, just before you came, Percy, James was being boastful towards Gordon about using the turntable. Gordon was having trouble balancing on the turntable and was worried he might get stuck. James had teased Gordon for not being able to use the turntable and being forced to pull his train tender first. He boasted to Gordon that he would never stick on the turntable due to his smaller size. However, when he went to line up on the turntable, a gale wind came along and pushed James round like a spinning top. That's the story Gordon told me, and I think James is a bit embarrassed." Percy laughed at the thought, but Edward was right. Every time James would near a turntable, he would always complain about them because of his incident, even though he quietly knew it wasn't the fault of the turntable. Henry and Gordon thought it was very funny and would always tease him about it whenever they are nearby. "Mind how you go, it's a bit windy today," teased Gordon. James had enough of it and made a decision. "Since I'm much smaller than you fat engines," he said to Gordon and Henry rudely, "I've decided to go backwards like Thomas and Percy." "Going backwards?" scoffed Gordon. "I only did that a few weeks ago because my tender was upsetting the balance of the turntable. I can tell you it wasn't a pleasant experience when I was pulling the express." "Nope, you can't scare me. My mind is made up." And that was that. The next day, James's plan was put into fruition. He puffed out of the shed and made his way towards his coaches instead of the turntable. The passengers in the coaches were confused. "Shouldn't you be on a turntable, James?" asked the coaches. "The turntable is broken today," he lied. "So driver says we have to go backwards." "But this is the main line," gasped the coaches. But James ignored them and he went on his way. "I don't need that thing, I don't need that thing," he said to himself inwardly. He passed the other engines, whistling proudly. Look at me, I don't need a turntable," he proclaimed. He made it to the big station at the end of the line safe and sound. James felt proud, but Sir Topham Hatt 1 didn't think the same. "James, What's this that I hear about you not going on the turntables and taking your trains backwards instead?
Turntables are nothing but trouble, sir. They make engines twist around and round like a spinning top toy when they're out of control.
That wasn't the fault of the turntable, James. That was caused by the wind. Honestly, James, it's dangerous for a tender engine to travel too fast backwards. You could derail.
Well, why then does Thomas go fast backwards, sir? He doesn't need a turntables, and neither should I.
Because he's a tank engine, James. They were designed to be a smaller size and without a tender that would obscure the driver's view. If you don't use a turntable, James, I will send you to your shed. And this time, don't be so sure I'll let you out again so soon. James pouted, and later that day he complained about it bitterly to the other engines at the sheds.
He's right, James. There are engines on the mainland who once thought the same thing as you, but they soon learnt the consequences. Pah! The fat controller is silly. I've been pulling my trains backwards all day today and didn't have any accidents. So I must be doing something better than those engines you're referring to.
Edward rolled his eyes in frustration. Well, you'll learn sooner than later, James. And he went to sleep. The next day, James was set to take a goods train to the other side of Sodor. To avoid using the turntable at Tidmouth, James snuck out early in the morning to turn himself around on the nearest Y rail. He arrived at Barrow and Furnace later that morning and parked his trucks into a siding.
Now, James, said his driver, there's no Y rail nearby, so we're going to have to use the turntable here.
No, we're not, James protested.
The fat controller's orders, replied the driver crossly.
The fat controller can't always be right, and neither is Edward. I ran backwards with my train yesterday without using those troublesome spinning things, so we're not going on it today.
We don't have time to argue, groaned the driver. We have more goods trains to bring here, and you having a petty argument about turntables isn't helping.
But James refused to move. The crew had no choice but to admit defeat, and took James back to the big station tender first. James was pleased, and he was having a pleasant time puffing backwards through the Sodor countryside.
I don't need it, he said proudly.
He decided that going backwards was working so well that he would go fast to make up the lost time. Unknown to him, however, up ahead the tracks had buckled. He couldn't see them in order to react, and was going too fast to cross them safely.
Ah! I'm coming off the rails! He shouted.
His crew jumped out of the cab as the red engine toppled over onto the ground and landed on his side.
Ow!
His crew, who were luckily unhurt, were checking him all over to see if James was hurt. James felt embarrassed as his driver came towards him.
I'm not the type that says I told you so, but I told you so.
Funny thing, this is the same field as where you had your first accident, his driver chuckled. James just pouted. So Topham Hatt 1 arrived on board Edward, and unsurprisingly he was very cross with James. He scolded him severely for not doing what he was told. Then he said, "Just for that, you will stay here and think about what you have done."
What?
I know it's harsh, but it's for your own good.
Yes, sir,
stuttered James. So for a few days, James was left in the field feeling sad. He began to think about his misbehavior around turntables. Henry came with Sir Topham Hatt 1, and James soon said,
"I'm very sorry for the accident that I caused, sir. It was wrong of me not to listen to you about the dangers of going backwards as a tender engine. I won't ignore turntables ever again, sir."
"Excellent idea, James. We'll get you back onto the rails now," replied Sir Topham Hatt happily. He turned towards Henry and told him to get the breakdown train. James was soon repaired at the works and he went back to work. And to this day, whenever James travels on his journeys, he makes sure that he always uses the turntable.